Did you know the US military has spent $9 billion trying to retire 2 helicopters, and failed every single time? One flew combat missions in Vietnam, the other entered service the year the Macintosh was invented. Together, they've logged nearly a century of combined flight, and right now, today, both are killing people in active combat. For replacement programs, for cancellations, $9 billion, nothing to show for it. The most advanced helicopter ever built, stealthy, nearly undetectable, capable of crossing the Atlantic, was scrapped not because it failed, because it worked too well and cost too much. So here's the question nobody at the Pentagon will answer on the record. Is America unable to replace the Cobra and the Apache? Or has it simply stopped believing that replacing them is worth it? The Apache entered service in 1984. The Cobra flew its first combat missions in Vietnam, more than half a century ago. Both were designed for a Cold War that never turned hot, built to fight Soviet tank columns across the plains of Central Europe in a war that never happened. And yet, as of the time this script was written, both are still flying. The Apache is in active combat right now. That is not supposed to be how military procurement works. Weapons are supposed to get replaced. Better technology comes along, older platforms get retired, and the cycle continues. That is exactly what happened with the fighter jets, the ships, the infantry vehicles, and almost every other major weapons platform in the American arsenal. But not these two. The US military tried to replace them 4 separate times. It spent somewhere in the region of $9 billion across those 4 programs. Every single one was cancelled. And the question of why that keeps happening reveals something important, not just about helicopters, but about how modern warfare is changing in ways nobody fully anticipated. The Cobra was never supposed to be a serious weapons program. It was an improvisation. The legendary UH-1 Huey had proven itself essential in Vietnam, moving troops across large stretches of land faster than any previous conflict had demanded. But someone noticed that if a utility helicopter was that useful, there might be room to explore what a dedicated attack helicopter could do. Bell, the contractor behind the Huey, had already been developing the idea internally. The Air Force did not like the Army operating its own helicopters, viewing it as a breach of their territory. The Army did not trust the Air Force with close air support, believing they did not take that role seriously enough. Into that institutional standoff, Bell offered a simple solution. Take the Huey platform, redesign the fuselage, and turn it into an attack helicopter without going through a formal competition that would have taken years. The result shared about 80% of its components with the Huey, which meant it could be repaired in the field using Huey parts. The biggest change was the fuselage, which became narrow and aerodynamic, resembling a fighter jet from certain angles. It was faster than the Huey, harder to hit, and carried significantly more firepower. The Army could purchase it quickly, deploy it immediately, and the soldiers who already knew the Huey could adapt to it without starting from scratch. The Cobra was, by any honest definition, an improvised weapon that just happened to work extremely well. The Marines eventually wanted their own version of the Cobra, which is how the platform migrated between service branches and kept evolving. But the Army had already moved on. By the time the Marines were developing their Super Cobra variant, the Army was building something completely new. That something was the Apache. The Apache was designed from the ground up as a dedicated attack helicopter with no compromise toward utility. The cockpit and rotor blades could sustain hits from 23mm rounds. Twin engines each produced almost 1,700 horsepower, giving the aircraft enough lift to carry serious weapons loads. The main gun was a 30mm M2 30-chain gun with 1,200 rounds, and the stub wings could carry combinations of Hellfire missiles, air-to-air missiles, and unguided rockets depending on the mission type. In an anti-armor role, the Apache could take off with 16 Hellfire missiles. In a covering force role requiring engagement of both armored and lightly armored targets, it could carry 8 Hellfires and 38 rockets alongside the chain gun. During the Gulf War, 277 Apaches destroyed 278 Iraqi tanks, with only a single Apache lost in combat, and the crew surviving. The flying tank, as it became known, seemed to justify every dollar spent on it. The 21st century complicated that record. In Iraq and Afghanistan, Apaches started taking fire from rifle rounds and parts of the airframe that turned out to be surprisingly vulnerable despite the armored cockpit. The helicopter had been designed for a peer adversary with heavy armor. It was now operating against insurgents with small arms in dense urban environments it was never built for. The Army kept flying it anyway, because nothing better existed, and the cost of replacing it was staggering. The first attempt to build something better than the Cobra actually predated the Apache entirely. Lockheed's AH-56 Cheyenne was supposed to be America's first dedicated attack helicopter helicopter, developed under the Advanced Aerial Fire Support System program launched in 1964. The requirements were aggressive. The helicopter had to cruise at 224 miles per hour, dash at 250, and hover at 6,000 feet. The Cheyenne used fixed wings rather than stub wings, which improved speed performance significantly. It also had a pusher propeller that provided additional thrust and reduced the load on the rotor. By 1967, it was demonstrating impressive maneuverability at public shows, landing on its two forward landing gear and bowing to the audience at the end of one demonstration. On paper, it was faster, better armed, and just as maneuverable as the Cobra that was already flying combat missions in Vietnam. The problem was timing. By 1969, the Cobra had been in Vietnam for 2 years and the Army needed attack helicopters now, not in a few years when the Cheyenne might be ready. One test pilot had already been killed during development. Digital weapon systems were being developed while the Cheyenne was still being designed around analog systems that were becoming outdated. American involvement in Vietnam was winding down and the urgency that had driven the program evaporated with it. The development contract was cancelled in 1972. The Cheyenne was simply developed at the wrong time, by the wrong methods, for a war that was already ending. The Boeing Sikorsky RH-66 Comanche is probably the most spectacular failure on the list, and not because it was a bad helicopter. By most accounts, it was an extraordinary one. Development started in the late 1980s with the goal of building a stealth helicopter that could replace both the Cobra and the OH-58 Kiowa Scout helicopter. Its radar cross-section was 360 times smaller than the Apache's. Its acoustic signature was dramatically lower than comparable helicopters. It could carry missiles internally to preserve its stealth profile, deploying stub wings only when stealth mattered less than maximum firepower. The Army was ready to order around 1,200 of them by the early 2000s. First deliveries were expected in 2006. Then in 2004, the program was abruptly cancelled. 4 reasons drove that decision, and 3 of them came down to money. The Cold War had ended, removing the original strategic justification for a helicopter with a 1,400-mile ferry range designed to operate deep behind Soviet lines. There were already hundreds of Apaches in service, and introducing Comanches would require an entirely new production and maintenance network. Drones were becoming capable enough to take over the Scout role the Comanche was partly designed to fill, and the projected total cost of development and full production had grown to almost $27 billion. The program had already consumed $8 billion by the time it was terminated, including the cancellation fee. That was the cheaper of the 2 options. The Army did not stop trying after Comanche. The Armed Reconnaissance Helicopter program was launched almost immediately after Comanche was cancelled, this time with a much more modest goal. Bell won the initial contract with a plan to militarize its existing Bell 407 civilian helicopter, fitting it with a better engine and weapons. The helicopter was the smallest platform considered for the role and generally unimpressive in early assessments. On its maiden flight, it lost all engine power. The pilots barely managed to land it. The prototype was destroyed. The program was quickly terminated. The Army tried again with the Armed Aerial Scout program, which did not even reach the contract awarding stage. The Boeing AH-6, based on the legendary MH-6 Little Bird, was developed but ultimately rejected because of poor survivability. The Sikorsky S-97 Raider emerged from this effort and was later resurrected as the Raider X for the Future Attack Reconnaissance Aircraft program, known as FARA. FARA launched in 2018 with 2 competing designs, the Sikorsky Raider X and the Bell 360 Invictus. The Raider X was a compound helicopter with coaxial rotors and a pusher propeller, expected to reach speeds approaching 300 miles per hour. The Invictus was slightly slower but more conventional in layout. Both were cancelled in 2024. The Army stated that the intended use of Scout and attack helicopters was losing its practical value because inexpensive unmanned aerial vehicles could fill the same role at lower cost. $9 billion and 2 decades later, the Army walked away from the entire category. The answer to the title question is layered, and the most honest version of it has nothing to do with the quality of the Cobra or the Apache. Both helicopters have genuine vulnerabilities. The Apache has proven surprisingly fragile in certain combat environments. The Cobra family has survived largely by evolving into the Viper, which is now on its 3rd generation of the same basic design. Neither platform is the best possible solution to the problems it was built to solve. The real answer is that every replacement program ran into one or more of three problems. The first was timing. The Cheyenne arrived when the Cobra was already in combat, and the Army had no patience for further delays. The second was cost. The Comanche grew into a program so expensive that cancellation was cheaper than completion. The third was strategic irrelevance. The Cold War ended, drone technology advanced, and the entire premise of a dedicated manned scout and attack helicopter became harder to justify with each passing year. There are, at the time of writing, no ongoing attack helicopter development programs in the United States. The Apache and the Cobra, now in its Viper form, will likely remain not just the first but the only dedicated attack helicopters in the American arsenal. The question the Army eventually stopped being able to answer was not whether a better helicopter was possible. It almost certainly is. The question was whether any amount of money spent on a better helicopter made sense when a drone could do most of the same job for a fraction of the price. The rise of drones since the early 2000s did not just make scout helicopters redundant. It forced a fundamental rethink of what manned attack aviation is actually for. Russia's attack helicopter fleet, which includes platforms developed during the Cold War, has performed poorly in Ukraine, with more than 100 losses to anti-air systems and Ukrainian drones. China began developing attack helicopters in the early 2000s but built only around 200 of each type, a cautious number that reflects uncertainty about their long-term value. The Eurocopter Tiger has 175 units spread across 4 armies. Not even the French and Australian militaries, both significant NATO contributors, believe the category justifies heavy investment anymore. The United States, which produced more than 2,700 Apaches and currently operates around 750, has fewer than 1,000 attack helicopters across all service branches combined. The Cobra and the Apache were not kept because they are irreplaceable. They were kept because every replacement either failed, cost too much, or became obsolete before it reached the field. The lesson is not that these two helicopters are uniquely excellent. The lesson is that the window for manned attack helicopters as a dominant battlefield platform may already be closing, and the $9 billion spent trying to extend it may have been the clearest signal of all.